the spring of 1947, a massive factory floor in Marysville, Michigan, went suddenly quiet. Garwood Industries ordered the immediate, permanent shutdown of its civilian boat division. The mahogany dust was swept away. The craftsmen were sent home. The production lines stopped. Outside the plant gates, the United States was entering the greatest post-war economic expansion in its history, and Americans were desperate to get back on the water. Inside the facility, the builder of the fastest, most expensive runabouts in the country was quietly liquidating its inventory. A decade earlier, that exact same name had represented the absolute pinnacle of American maritime wealth. It was the brand that dominated the private docks of Lake Tahoe, Biscayne Bay, and the Thousand Islands. It was a badge of speed that often cost twice as much as a standard Chris craft, demanding the finest marine engineering and the most flawless wood finishing of the era. The corporation did not close the boatyard because the vessels had stopped being beautiful. They did not close because the boats had slowed down. They did not close because there were no wealthy buyers left. They closed the doors because the parent company realized that building heavy dump trucks, hydraulic hoists, and industrial winches generated a highly predictable profit margin, while crafting perfect wooden hulls by hand produced an accounting nightmare. The boats simply could not scale. But the real story of Garwood boats in America is not just the cold arithmetic of a 1947 corporate ledger. It is the story of an uncompromising obsession with mechanical perfection, colliding with the realities of industrial mass production. It is a story of how a brand born from brutal, high-speed racing dominance transformed into the ultimate symbol of American leisure, only to be dismantled when the post-war market demanded volume instead of varnish. Somewhere in a marina, in a museum, in a boatyard, or in a quiet shipyard office, there is a builder's plate with a name and an American story behind it. We tell those stories. Subscribe if you want to hear them. The story begins not in a post-war corporate boardroom, but on the water, in Algonac, Michigan, in the early 1920s. The St. Clair River runs deep, fast, and cold, acting as the maritime artery between Lake Huron and Lake St. Clair. In the years immediately following the First World War, this stretch of Michigan water served as the primary testing ground for the American marine industry. It was here that Garfield Arthur Wood, a former lightning rod salesman and inventor, decided to turn a personal obsession into a commercial enterprise. Wood was not born into a traditional shipbuilding dynasty. He was an industrialist who had already made a massive fortune by inventing the hydraulic hoist for dump trucks, a piece of heavy machinery that transformed American construction and logistics. But the wealth generated by Garwood Industries simply provided the capital for his true pursuit: absolute speed on the water. Wood approached boat building not as an exercise in leisurely craftsmanship, but as a brutal equation of horsepower and hull dynamics. He began by purchasing the racing designs of another local builder, Christopher Columbus Smith, the man who would later found Chris Craft, and systematically refined them. Wood campaigned a series of hydroplanes named Miss America, dominating international competition and violently wresting the Harmsworth Trophy from the British. He became an American hero, a man who consistently proved that American engineering could outrun the established European maritime aristocracy. But a racing hydroplane was a highly specialized, dangerous machine. It was not a product that could be sold to the public. Before the arrival of Garwood's retail boats, the American recreational maritime market was sharply divided. If an industrialist, a Wall Street financier, or a Detroit automotive executive wanted to spend time on the water, they typically commissioned large, slow, heavy displacement steam or diesel yachts. These vessels were floating palaces designed for comfort and distance. If that same wealthy American wanted to go fast, the options were practically non-existent. There were no off-the-shelf, high-performance powerboats available for purchase. To achieve high speeds, an owner had to commission a custom, experimental racing shell from a boutique boatyard, hire a specialized mechanic to keep it running, and accept the constant risk of mechanical failure or structural disintegration. The American market lacked a vessel that combined the blistering speed of a race boat with the reliability, finish, and comfort of a luxury automobile. The catalyst that allowed Garwood to bridge that gap was a byproduct of the American military-industrial complex. Following the end of the First World War, The United States government possessed thousands of surplus Liberty Vi-12 aircraft engines. Designed for combat aircraft, these massive 400 horsepower power plants were sitting idle in federal warehouses. Wood recognized an unprecedented opportunity. He purchased the surplus engines in bulk, modified them for marine cooling and transmission systems, and designed a hull specifically to carry them. The result was the American entry of the Garwood boat brand, the introduction of the 33-foot Baby Gar runabout in 1922. This was not merely a boat, it was an entirely new category of American maritime commerce. The Baby Gar featured a stepped, planing hull constructed of double-planked mahogany, built with an obsessive level of structural integrity to withstand the immense torque of the Liberty V-12. When the throttle was pushed forward, the heavy wooden boat did not plow through the water. It rose up and skimmed across the surface, achieving speeds approaching 50 miles per hour in an era when most commercial vessels struggled to reach 15. The financial threshold for this performance was staggering. In 1922, a 33-foot Baby Gar carried a purchase price of roughly $9,800. In modern economic terms, that equates to approximately $180,000, a figure that placed it entirely out of reach for the average American boater. The Baby Gar cost more than many waterfront homes, but for the elite class of the Roaring Twenties, the price was a filter, not a barrier. The early reception in the American market was characterized by intense fascination. The trade press of the period, including influential publications like Motorboating and Yachting, dedicated extensive coverage to Wood's transition from racing champion to retail boat builder. By 1923, the Baby Gar began appearing at the National Motorboat Show in New York, instantly drawing the attention of the country's wealthiest citizens. The initial customer list read like a registry of American industrial and cultural royalty. Newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst purchased early models. Elite families from Detroit, Chicago, and New York placed orders. The boats were shipped to the private docks of the Thousand Islands, the exclusive marinas of Long Island Sound, and the clear, cold waters of Lake Tahoe. In these enclaves, the Baby Gar served a specific social and functional purpose. It allowed the owner to assert absolute dominance over their local waterway. To prove the reliability of his consumer vessels, Wood executed massive, highly publicized endurance runs. In one legendary demonstration, he raced a Garwood runabout against the Havana Special Express train down the eastern seaboard from Miami to New York. The boat beat the train. This was not a racing stunt. It was a calculated marketing operation designed to prove to the American buyer that a Garwood hull could endure punishing ocean conditions for hours on end without failing. By the late 1920s, the Garwood Boat Division had established itself as a distinct, highly prestigious manufacturing arm within the broader Garwood corporate empire. The production lines in Marysville, Michigan, were turning out smaller models alongside the massive Liberty-powered runabouts, expanding the catalog while maintaining the uncompromising standards of the original. They had successfully identified a void in the American water culture, filled it with aircraft horsepower and flawless mahogany, and convinced the American elite that speed was the ultimate luxury. But creating a luxury product was only the first step. To survive in the American maritime market, a brand had to build an infrastructure of desire. To understand why Garwood dominated the elite American market, one must look at the physical object itself. When an American buyer walked down the wooden docks of a marina in 1928 and approached a 33-foot Garwood runabout, they were not looking at a standard recreational boat. They were looking at a piece of floating industrial art. The visual impact was immediate and overwhelming. The hull was constructed using a technique called double-planked mahogany, a hull-building method using two overlapping layers of premium wood, separated by heavy canvas and marine glue, creating a watertight, incredibly rigid structure capable of absorbing violent wave impacts. The wood was not painted. It was sealed, stained, and finished with up to 10 coats of marine varnish, giving the deck a deep, glass-like reflection that mirrored the water around it. Beneath the polished wood lay the mechanical breakthrough. Garwood utilized a refined V-bottom hull, a design featuring a sharp V-shaped profile at the bow that gradually flattens toward the stern, allowing the boat to cut through choppy water rather than pounding flat against it. This was an aggressive planing hull, a design engineered to use hydrodynamic lift to rise out of the water, dramatically reducing drag and allowing for unprecedented speeds. But pushing a heavy solid wood boat out of the water required massive continuous torque. For this, Garwood relied on massive inboard engines, power plants mounted deep inside the hull, driving a heavy bronze propeller through a fixed metal shaft. While early models used surplus Liberty aircraft engines, the company soon partnered with elite manufacturers like the Scripps Motor Company and Chrysler to supply custom Marine V12 and inline-six engines. These were heavy iron block Leviathans that required a dedicated marine transmission, a heavy-duty gearbox designed specifically to handle the continuous, brutal load of pushing dense water, allowing the captain to shift into forward, neutral, and reverse. The dashboard resembled an airplane cockpit centered around a mechanical tachometer, a dashboard gauge that measures the rotational speed of the engine crankshaft, crucial for preventing the engine from tearing itself apart at high speeds. When the ignition was turned, a Garwood did not sputter to life. It roared with the deep, mechanical resonance of an aircraft ready for takeoff. The price for this engineering was astronomical. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, a standard 28-foot Garwood runabout carried a retail price of roughly $4,500. A top-tier 33-foot model with a twin-engine configuration could easily exceed $11,000. In modern American currency, that range translates to roughly $80,000 to over $200,000. To put this in its proper American economic context, a mass-produced 26-foot Chris Craft runabout could be purchased for less than $3,000. Garwood was actively choosing to ignore the emerging middle-class boating market. They were building machines for the absolute top fraction of 1%. This pricing strategy dictated a completely different distribution breakthrough. Garwood did not sell boats through standard, dusty boatyards covered in sawdust. They sold them through exclusive, automotive-style showrooms in major metropolitan centers. The brand established a flagship presence in New York City, debuting their flawless hulls at the National Motorboat Show under bright electric lights. Wealthy industrialists could inspect the heavy-cast bronze deck hardware, metal fittings used to secure lines, heavily chrome-plated to resist the corrosive marine environment. They could touch the pleated leather upholstery, grip the automotive-style steering wheel, and sign a contract without ever getting their shoes wet. Once the order was placed, the vessels were shipped to the most exclusive waterways in the United States. Within a few short years, Garwood runabouts became a mandatory fixture at the Detroit Yacht Club, where automotive executives raced them on the Detroit River. They filled the private boathouses of the Lake George Club in upstate New York. They appeared at the Miami Beach marinas, tearing across Biscayne Bay in the winter months. They dominated the sheltered waters of the Thousand Islands Yacht Club. They became the undisputed kings of Lake Tahoe, where the high altitude and deep, cold water demanded a hull that could handle sudden weather shifts and engines that would not choke in the thin mountain air. What competitors could not replicate was the Garwood moat, the exact uncompromising synthesis of high-performance racing heritage and flawless luxury finish. Other American boat builders could make a fast, stripped-down racing shell, but it would be uncomfortable, wet, and ugly. Other shipyards could build a beautiful mahogany cruiser, but it would be slow, heavy, and sluggish. Garwood delivered a machine that could cross a rough lake at 50 miles per hour without rattling the deck hardware loose, while the owner sat behind a swept-back windshield in dry, windshielded comfort. To keep these vessels running, a specialized American service infrastructure had to evolve around them. An owner could not simply tie a Garwood to a public dock and walk away. They required a covered boathouse, a permanent structure built directly over the water to protect the varnished deck from the blistering sun and rot-inducing rain. They required an electric boat hoist, a mechanized lifting system to physically raise the wooden hull out of the water when not in use, preventing the wood from soaking up excess weight, and they required the constant attention of a specialized marine mechanic, a technician trained to synchronize twin carburetors, align heavy drive shafts, and tune aircraft-grade engines in the damp, cramped environment of a boat bilge. Garwood had successfully convinced the American elite that the ultimate luxury was not comfort, it was command. The ability to violently throttle an engine, manipulate the water, and outrun anything else on the lake became an addiction for the industrial class. The name on the builder's plate was not a country of origin, it was a specification. By the early 1930s, the Garwood brand had transcended its origins as a Michigan racing experiment and evolved into the definitive metric of American maritime wealth. While the broader United States economy collapsed under the weight of the Great Depression, the extreme upper tier of the American market, the industrial titans, banking families, and Hollywood elite refused to abandon the water. For this specific demographic, a Garwood was not a recreational purchase. It was an essential social asset. To support this elite demand, the company built an exclusive American professional ecosystem that completely bypassed standard boating infrastructure. In upstate New York, the heavy mahogany hulls dominated the private docks of the Lake George Club, where old money demanded flawless finishing and smooth rides. In Florida, the boats were tied up outside the Miami Beach Rod and Reel Club, favored by owners who needed extreme speed to cut across Biscayne Bay before the violent afternoon thunderstorms rolled in. On the St. Lawrence River, the renowned marine dealer Fitzgerald and Lee served the sprawling summer estates of the Thousand Islands, keeping a dedicated fleet of technicians on hand strictly to service Garwood's massive V12 engines. Out west, at Obexer's Boat Company in California, the high-horsepower hulls became the undisputed champions of Lake Tahoe. At an elevation of over 6,000 feet, the thin mountain air routinely choked standard marine engines, leaving lesser boats sluggish and underpowered. But Garwood's aircraft-derived power plants simply breathed deeper, burned more fuel, and ran harder, solidifying the brand's reputation in one of the most demanding boating environments in the United States. The sheer scale of their dominance at the absolute top of the market was staggering. By the mid-1930s, the Marysville, Michigan factory was operating with industrial precision, producing an expanded lineup that ranged from nimble 18-foot utility boats to towering 33-foot custom Leviathans. While exact production records were later lost or destroyed during corporate restructuring, industry estimates suggest that at its peak, the factory was completing several hundred highly customized, hand-built wooden hulls per year. In a market where a single 28-foot boat could cost $4,500, roughly $100,000 today, that volume represented a colossal concentration of capital flowing directly into the Michigan boatyard. The distribution architecture was deliberately engineered to reinforce this exclusivity. An owner in Chicago did not buy a Garwood from a dusty waterfront boatyard covered in sawdust. They purchased it from a specialized dealer near Navy Pier, reviewing leather swatches, chrome hardware options, and engine specifications as if commissioning a custom locomotive. The boats were heavily promoted in the pages of yachting and motorboating magazines, not with copy about family picnics or weekend fishing, but with stark, aggressive claims about top speed, sustained horsepower, and racing pedigree. The National Motorboat Show at the Grand Central Palace in New York City served as the brand's primary cathedral. Here, beneath massive chandeliers, the company displayed their polished mahogany hulls on elevated platforms. They drew crowds of thousands who knew they could never afford the vessels, but simply wanted to stand in the presence of the highest standard of American marine craftsmanship. Garwood had successfully convinced the United States that they were not just building boats, they were building the ultimate expression of American mechanical supremacy. The American cultural moment that defined Garwood's absolute peak occurred during the darkest economic years of the 1930s. The Great Depression had decimated the broader boating industry, wiping out hundreds of regional boat builders who catered to the evaporating middle class. Yet in a paradox that defined the era, the market for extreme, custom-built luxury vessels actually intensified among the ultra-wealthy. For the American industrial elite, the water became an insulated sanctuary, a place where the economic collapse could not reach, and where the brutal competition of the boardroom could be translated into organized racing on private lakes. During this period, Garwood did not retreat. The company leaned into its reputation for uncompromising extravagance. The brand introduced the custom series of runabouts, vessels that stretched up to 33 feet and featured an enclosed limousine-style cabin. A permanent wooden roof structure with sliding glass windows designed to protect owners from the wind and spray while running at extreme speeds. These floating limousines were purchased by the likes of the Wrigley family in Chicago and the auto barons of Detroit. They were not merely transportation. They were heavy, polished, roaring declarations of immunity from the financial ruin that surrounded the rest of the country. The culture of informal, high-stakes racing among owners became a defining feature of the brand's American identity. On the deep, clear waters of the St. Lawrence River, wealthy summer residents would frequently line up their Gar Woods against rival V12 runabouts, running at full throttle for miles down the shipping channel. These were not sanctioned races with trophies. They were highly personal contests of ego, engineering, and capital. Gar Wood actively encouraged this behavior, knowing that every time one of their hulls overtook a competitor in front of a yacht club veranda, it virtually guaranteed another custom order. But the true measure of these vessels was not found on calm water. It was found when the American geography turned hostile. On a violently choppy afternoon on Lake Tahoe, when a sudden mountain squall turned the surface into a chaotic field of whitecaps and forced lesser boats to seek immediate shelter, a flatter, lighter hull would pound relentlessly, force the captain to pull the throttle back, and risk swamping over the low transom. But the heavy, double-planked, deep V of a Garwood runabout, driven by the massive, sustained torque of a Scripps V12 engine, could keep the throttles pinned, carve through the turbulent chop without shuddering, and keep the crew perfectly dry, proving to the owner that the immense price tag had bought them absolute mastery over the elements. This level of performance required a highly specialized American support ecosystem that reached its zenith in the late 1930s. The marinas that serviced these vessels, from the protected slips of the New York Athletic Club at Travers Island to the heavy timber boathouses of Lake George, functioned more like aviation hangars than traditional boatyards. The mechanics who maintained the Garwood fleets were highly paid specialists, trained to synchronize multiple carburetors, polish heavy brass cooling lines, and perfectly align massive propeller shafts, the heavy steel rods that connect the engine transmission to the external propeller. The owners rarely touched the engines themselves. The boat was a machine operated by the owner, but kept alive by a hidden army of American maritime labor. To stand on an American dock at the height of the brand's glory was a profoundly sensory experience. Picture a private marina in Biscayne Bay in the winter of 1938. A 28-foot Garwood custom runabout sits idling in the green water. The sun reflects blindingly off the heavily chromed deck ventilators, metal cowlings designed to force fresh air into the volatile engine compartment. The hull, finished in 10 coats of spar varnish, glows with a deep reddish-brown fire, its grain perfectly matched across every plank. The exhaust note is a low, rhythmic, menacing rumble, bubbling heavily through the water at the stern. When the hired captain shifts the heavy brass lever into gear, the boat does not jerk or hesitate. It surges forward with the smooth, inevitable force of a locomotive, leaving a perfectly symmetrical wake as it heads out toward the Atlantic. By 1939, Garwood Industries' boat division had achieved a near-mythical status. While the exact production numbers from the pre-war era are heavily fragmented, records suggest the Marysville factory was producing over 100 different catalog variations, ranging from nimble open utilities to massive custom cruisers. The dealer network, though highly restricted, covered every major concentration of wealth in the United States. They had established a dominant presence in Miami, a stronghold in New York, an absolute monopoly on the high-altitude lakes of the West, and an unbreakable reputation on the Great Lakes. They had taken the raw, violent engineering of a racing hydroplane, wrapped it in the finest mahogany available, and sold it to the American elite as the ultimate status symbol. The order books were full, the production lines were optimized, the brand name was synonymous with victory, but the world outside the Michigan factory was changing rapidly, and the structural forces that would eventually dismantle the empire were already gathering on the horizon. The American turning point for Garwood boats did not arrive as a sudden, dramatic failure on the water. It began quietly in the late 1930s, hidden behind the brand's elite reputation, driven by a structural shift in the American maritime economy that the company chose to ignore. The force that would eventually dismantle the runabout empire was domestic shipyard, dealer and fleet dominance, specifically the aggressive rise of mass production competitors like Chris-Craft and Century, who were fundamentally rewriting the rules of the domestic market. While Garwood Industries continued to dedicate massive resources to building custom, heavy mahogany vessels for the ultra-wealthy Chris Craft, located just miles away in Algonac, Michigan, had adopted automotive-style assembly lines. By 1939, Chris Craft was producing thousands of recreational boats annually, utilizing standardized parts, simplified hull forms, and efficient labor practices. They built a massive dealer network that reached deeply into the emerging American middle class. A middle-class buyer in Ohio or Florida could walk into a local dealership and purchase a dependable, attractive Chris Craft utility boat for roughly $500, about $33,000 today. It did not have the crushing horsepower of a Garwood, and it lacked the 10 coats of hand-rubbed varnish, but it allowed a family to get on the water reliably and affordably. Garwood's response to this market shift was structurally flawed. They attempted to introduce a line of smaller, less expensive utility boats to compete, but the company culture was fundamentally incapable of compromising on quality. Their entry-level models were still over-engineered, overbuilt, and priced significantly higher than the competition. More importantly, the Garwood dealer network remained an elite, highly restricted club. They did not have the volume of localized marinas, regional boatyards, and small-town dealers necessary to move thousands of units. A brand cannot survive indefinitely on prestige alone when the infrastructure of the market is shifting toward volume. When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, this commercial vulnerability was temporarily masked by the absolute mandate of wartime production. The American civilian recreational boating market ceased to exist overnight. The United States government immediately redirected all strategic materials, mahogany, bronze, steel, and marine engines, toward the military effort. The Garwood Marysville facility was completely repurposed by the Department of the Navy and the War Department. The highly skilled craftsmen who had spent their careers matching the grain on luxury runabouts were suddenly tasked with building utilitarian military vessels. The plant produced target boats, fast, remotely operated, or heavily armored vessels used for naval gunnery practice, alongside specialized utility craft and rescue boats. Simultaneously, the broader Garwood Industries Corporation shifted into maximum overdrive, generating immense profits by manufacturing hydraulic dump trucks, winches, and heavy logistical equipment for the Allied forces in Europe and the Pacific. During the war years, the civilian boat division was essentially frozen. The pristine showrooms in New York and Miami were shuttered. The heavy wooden boathouses on Lake George and the St. Lawrence River sat empty, their massive V12 engines decommissioned and greased for long-term storage while their owners went to war. When the war ended in 1945, the American maritime landscape had fundamentally changed. The country experienced an unprecedented economic boom, and a massive, newly affluent middle class returned from the war, desperate for recreation. The demand for pleasure boats skyrocketed. Domestic competitors like Chris Craft pivoted immediately back to civilian production, capitalizing on their pre-war mass-market infrastructure to flood lakes and coastal waters with standardized wooden cruisers and runabouts. Garwood, however, struggled violently to restart its civilian boat operations. The immediate post-war period in America was defined by severe supply chain disruptions. Premium Honduran mahogany, the essential material that defined the Garwood aesthetic, was incredibly scarce and astronomically expensive. High-performance marine engines were similarly difficult to source, as industrial foundries struggled to transition from military contracts back to civilian orders. But the most fatal blow came not from the supply chain, but from inside the Garwood Industries corporate structure. Garfield Arthur Wood had retired and moved to Miami, leaving the massive industrial conglomerate in the hands of corporate managers. These executives were focused heavily on the highly lucrative heavy machinery market. When they reviewed the financial architecture of the Marysville Boat Division, the numbers presented an unsolvable problem. Building a Garwood runabout remained an intensely manual, artisanal process. It required specialized labor, highly paid carpenters, finishers, and marine mechanics who could not simply be replaced by assembly line workers. In an era of rising American labor costs, the profit margins on hand-built wooden boats were shrinking rapidly. The corporation realized that the floor space at the Marysville plant could generate significantly higher, far more predictable returns if it were used to assemble hydraulic truck hoists and industrial winches instead of luxury yachts. The boat division, once the crown jewel of the company's public identity, was now viewed by the accountants as an inefficient, low-margin liability. The technological disruption of the era further compounded the pressure. While fiberglass was still a few years away from dominating the market, new plywood construction techniques and simplified hull designs were already drastically reducing the maintenance and manufacturing costs for competing brands. The heavy double-plank mahogany hull, the very foundation of Garwood's superiority, was rapidly becoming an anachronism. It was too heavy, too expensive to build, and required too much specialized maintenance for the modern post-war consumer, who wanted to spend their weekends driving their boat, not paying a technician to repair it. The internal corporate math was absolute. In 1946, as Garwood Industries attempted to resume civilian operations at the Marysville plant, the financial disconnect became impossible to ignore. A 24-foot custom mahogany runabout required thousands of hours of highly specialized manual labor. A heavy hydraulic truck winch required a fraction of that time, utilized standardized steel casting, and guaranteed a fixed, high-margin return from municipal and industrial contractors. The parent company was no longer directed by a marine racing enthusiast. It was governed by an executive board focused entirely on American post-war infrastructure. The retreat of the brand from the American market happened with brutal corporate efficiency. Dealerships in New York, Chicago, and Miami that had spent the war years waiting for new Garwood inventory were suddenly informed that allocations would be severely limited and shortly thereafter completely canceled. The exclusive distribution network, once the foundation of the brand's elite status, began to dissolve. Without a reliable supply of new vessels to sell, prominent American marine dealers were forced to switch their allegiances. They pulled the polished Garwood signage from their waterfront showrooms and replaced it with the logos of domestic competitors who could actually deliver product. The competitive displacement was swift and unforgiving. Chris-Craft completely dominated the post-war waterways, flooding American lakes with standardized, relatively affordable wooden cruisers and runabouts. Simultaneously, Century Boats captured the high-performance utility market, offering speed and style without the crushing financial premium. Furthermore, the technological landscape of the American boating industry was shifting permanently beneath Garwood's feet. Post-war developments in marine plywood, a lighter, stronger, manufactured wood product that required vastly less maintenance than traditional planking, allowed builders like Higgins to produce fast, durable hulls at a fraction of the cost. The heavy, double-planked mahogany hull was increasingly viewed by the American consumer not as a luxury, but as a severe maintenance burden. To own a Garwood in the immediate post-war era meant paying a premium for a vessel that required constant, expensive upkeep at a specialized boatyard. The American boating public, fueled by rapid middle-class expansion, wanted convenience. They wanted to keep their boats on trailers in their driveways, not suspended in heavy timber boathouses on Lake Tahoe or Long Island Sound. The infrastructure of the market had fundamentally democratized, and Garwood's elite exclusionary business model no longer possessed the necessary volume to survive. In the spring of 1947, the final American chapter of the Garwood Boat Division was written. The executive board of Garwood Industries issued a directive to permanently liquidate the Marine Division. There was no grand farewell tour. There was no final commemorative runabout. The company simply ceased production. They laid off the master carpenters, marine finishers, and specialized mechanics who had spent decades perfecting the art of the mahogany runabout. The heavy industrial woodworking machinery was sold off or scrapped. The marine engineering blueprints were archived and forgotten. Within weeks, the Marysville factory floor was entirely cleared of sawdust and varnish fumes. The space was rapidly retooled to manufacture heavy truck bodies, hydraulic hoists, and industrial road building equipment. The brand that had defined absolute American maritime supremacy was unceremoniously erased by its own parent corporation because it could not meet the margin requirements of the post-war industrial economy. The dealers received their final letters. The Marysville plant doors closed. The master carpenters went home. The parts network collapsed. The mahogany supply chains vanished. The showroom floors went dark. The boats sat waiting on the water. The company built trucks instead. The silence that fell over the Marysville plant in 1947 was permanent. There was no miraculous corporate reversal. Garwood Industries never returned to the civilian maritime market. In a final, distinctly American industrial irony, the massive corporate entity that bore the name of the greatest speedboat racer in United States history spent the next several decades becoming famous for manufacturing garbage trucks. The heavy hydraulic refuse compactors that rolled through American suburbs in the 1950s and 1960s proudly carried the exact same Garwood badge that had once adorned the varnished dashboards of the fastest, most exclusive luxury yachts on the planet. By the time the parent corporation was eventually sold and absorbed into other industrial conglomerates, the memory of the mahogany runabouts had been almost entirely erased from the corporate ledgers. Some names simply do not survive the brutal transition from passion project to mass market industrial accounting. But while the parent corporation abandoned the water, a dedicated American preservation community refused to let the hulls rot. Today, the surviving pre-war Garwood runabouts are considered the absolute apex of the antique American boating market. In the specialized restoration yards of the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest, and New England, these boats are no longer treated as recreational vessels. They are treated as priceless maritime antiquities. Organizations like the Antique and Classic Boat Society and hyper-specific collector circles track the lineage of individual hulls with the same obsession usually reserved for fine art. At events like the Lake Tahoe Concours d'Elegance or the Sunnyland Antique Boat Festival in Lake Dora, Florida, a pristine, flawlessly restored 33-foot Garwood custom runabout can easily command prices approaching $500,000, and in rare cases, significantly more. The people who buy them today, wealthy collectors, maritime museums, dedicated restoration hobbyists, and preservation foundations, are not buying a boat for a weekend fishing trip. They are paying for the privilege of acting as the temporary custodian of a lost American craft. The mechanics who maintain them are no longer just technicians. They are highly specialized historians who must know how to source century-old ignition coils, hand-pour Babbitt bearings for antique V12 engines, and match the exact hue of a 1930s mahogany stain. The reason the original Garwood still matters so intensely to this community is deeply functional. In a modern American boating landscape completely dominated by sterile, mass-produced fiberglass, silent electric outboards, and digital joystick controls, a Garwood offers a violently tactile, unapologetically mechanical reality. A wooden runabout, properly maintained and heavily powered, crosses a quiet lake in a way that modern composite materials cannot replicate. It is not about efficiency. It is about the specific, heavy resonance of the wooden hull absorbing the chop. It is about the smell of hot engine oil mixing with fresh marine varnish. It is about the heavy analog resistance of the cast bronze steering wheel, the heat radiating from the engine compartment, and the deep guttural roar of an aircraft engine operating at full throttle. It belongs to a kind of American leisure that was never designed to be convenient, quiet, or digitized. The surprise footnote of the Garwood empire is not found in the wood, but in the water beneath it. Long after the Marysville plant closed, the hydrodynamic mathematics that Garfield Arthur Wood perfected, the aggressive deep V hull designed to carry massive, heavy horsepower without losing stability, became the foundational blueprint for the entire modern performance boating industry. When builders in Miami began designing offshore fiberglass racing boats in the 1960s to conquer the rough waters of the Atlantic, they were essentially building upon the hull geometry that Garwood had proved on the St. Clair River 40 years earlier. The material changed from mahogany to fiberglass, and the engines changed from surplus aircraft blocks to modern marine V8s. But the physics of pushing an American hull through hostile water at extreme speed remained exactly as the pioneer had written it. If you visit the original physical site of the Marysville Boat Works today, you will not find a monument to the V12 runabouts. The original factory footprint was swallowed by the relentless, shifting cycles of the Rust Belt economy, replaced by modern industrial parks, generic warehouses, and the quiet, working-class infrastructure of eastern Michigan. The maritime landscape of the St. Clair River still hums with commercial shipping and modern recreational boating, but the heavy rhythmic thunder of the Baby Gars no longer echoes off the Canadian shoreline. The story of Gar Wood Boats reveals a profound, unyielding truth about American commercial culture. It highlights the vast, unforgiving gap between what the American market professes to admire and what it is actually willing to sustain. Boaters, critics, and enthusiasts will always praise uncompromising craftsmanship, absolute performance, and flawless beauty. But the structural forces of the American economy, labor costs, raw material supply chains, dealer network demands, and the relentless pressure for quarterly corporate growth systematically destroy any product that cannot be mass-produced and easily maintained. When a marine vessel ceases to be a physical passion and becomes an accounting problem, the market will always choose the spreadsheet over the varnish. The United States builds the greatest machines in the world and then discards them the moment they become inconvenient. But high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, inside a darkened, heavy timber boathouse on the edge of Lake Tahoe, a 33-foot mahogany hull still rests in the cold, clear water, its 10 coats of varnish reflecting the dim light. Its massive V12 engine, thoroughly oiled and perfectly tuned, still waiting for the heavy wooden doors to open, for a hand to push the brass throttle forward, and for the lake to be calm enough to remember. See you in the next video.